Um, Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Sam Tallman. I'm Director of Energy Services at Green Power Technologies Puerto Rico and co-founder here at the Puerto Rico Energy Forum. My partner in conversation, Tom King, is on the line, but joining us from an airport. And so this is mostly going to be a conversation between me and our guest. But before we get to our guest, I'm going to just make a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are preparing for our annual event. Last year, we kicked off with our inaugural our inaugural iteration of Puerto Rico Clean Energy Week. And this year, we're doubling the effort. So we have 2 days of panels, discussions, keynotes, all around thought leadership, diverse perspectives, and engagement taking place September 15th and 16th at Vivo Beach Club. We will have a members workshop session Monday morning, and then Monday afternoon through all of Tuesday will be panels. We're going to be talking about microgrids, entrepreneurship, investors, commercial finance, what's happening at the federal level, nuclear energy, natural gas, solar, you name it. We're going to cover the whole gamut, and it's going to be an excellent event. So September 15th and 16th, tickets are now on sale. Early bird tickets go through August, and so you can find that on Eventbrite. Javier, I'll ask you to please put that link in the chat. So if you're interested in learning more, take a look at that link or reach out to Javier, Tom, or myself, and we'll orient you on all the information you need to know regarding Puerto Rico Clean Energy Week, September 15th and 16th at Vivo Beach Club. We are going to continue. Thank you, Javier. We're going to continue normal programming through August. We'll be promoting those conversations here in the next week. Remember, members get access to our monthly newsletter, as well as all of the articles and exclusive conversations that we have throughout the month. But without further ado, we're going to jump right into our general forum meeting today. We're joined by John Bozek. John is Chief Strategy Officer, Chief Strategy and Research Officer at Invest Puerto Rico. Previously, he was with V2A and has worked in community development finance institutions in New York and Puerto Rico and beyond, and was a Jeopardy contestant. Didn't win.
That's true.
Forgive
That is
him.
true. You're going
Welcome,
deep into
John.
my biography.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is Jeopardy a meaningful tool to gauge intellect, or just how quickly can you press
It's
the button?
meaningful to people who remember trivial things that other people don't necessarily remember about pop culture and movies and geography and that kind of stuff.
We won't judge you too harshly then. John, we were colleagues at Invest Puerto Rico for 4 years, and so I think we know each other pretty well.
Yeah.
But I want to pick your brain about what's going on with regards to economic development and how energy plays a role in that. We're seeing more and more emphasis put on energy as an input, but that also means that there's more and more emphasis on energy as a sector. And so we're going to dive into that duality.
hmm
But first question, if you had to name Puerto Rico's one comparative advantage, what is it? And what's a single metric that you move in the next 24 months, say, to prove that comparative advantage?
Puerto Rico's comparative advantage. I mean, it has to be the talent and the workforce that we have. The difficult thing is everybody knows the demographic challenges that we also have, and the fact that, being U.S. citizens and being able to have the mobility of, picking up and moving to the mainland, makes it difficult for us to retain that talent. But, you talk to any of the large multinationals who do business on the island, or even some of the smaller local companies, and what always comes up is that we have talent. Puerto Rico, and everybody's now talking about Bad Bunny. For an island of a little less than 3 million maybe people, we have an outsized footprint in terms of the cultural impact that the islands people have, and the impact in different sectors of the workforce. I always go back to, I've had conversations, a lot of in the 90s during the Celtic Tiger period of Ireland, there was movement for a lot of the same industries that we compete in, pharmaceutical manufacturing, medical device manufacturing. A lot of that, at least for the European Union market, started to move to Ireland. And I've had conversations with executives at those companies saying, and this is nothing against Ireland, but that their Puerto Rican counterparts are in terms of quality of the talent. There's no competition and they even bring Puerto Rican professionals to Ireland to do the trainings and the managerial, et cetera. So it's just not me. It's not just me speaking. But the quality of the talent here, especially in some of the subsectors like manufacturing, engineering, but also in creative industries, even in finance and some of those other sectors, is second to none. It's a double-edged sword though, because once mainland US companies understand that, and they understand the quality that comes out of my OS, for example, or the quality that comes out of some of our, again, creative industry sectors, they come here and they recruit, and it leaves the island. So the biggest challenge is, how do you create opportunities and create an environment where people will want to stay, create families here, keep their lives here on the island. But I always go back to, when people tell me, what's the one thing I should know about Puerto Rico? It's the people, and the talent that's available here, in specific sectors.
What lever can we pull to have better control over that advantage? People are leaving, people are well
Yeah,
trained, well educated, well
it's quality.
qualified, and leave. What's the best way? What lever do we have at our disposal to?
Sure. And this is not just in Puerto Rico. I've worked in economic development for almost 20 years now. And, I'm in all the professional organizations. I talk to other people, other economic development organizations in Europe, in Latin America, and of course in the United States. And a lot of it comes back to, people think a lot of times economic development is about having a luncheon with high level executives and a governor or whoever, shaking hands, giving out a tax incentive, and then building a giant facility. That's not what it's about. It's about creating the environment for economic development to happen, right? And one of the key levers there, and this is going to go and connect very closely with our conversation around energy, is quality of life. If you don't have the quality of life that the people will want to remain and stay and make a life for themselves, and be able to provide for their families, and have the same level of safety, the same level of cultural access, the same level of amenities, parks, hospitals, restaurants, all of those things, it becomes very difficult to attract and retain talent. So, going back to the energy question, you know, obviously there's challenges in terms of providing, high voltage lines to create an environment to have additional manufacturing in Puerto Rico. Obviously that's a challenge. But you on the quality of life side, you go back to, a lot of times people just don't want to have the headache of the power going out twice a month. And they say, screw this, I'm gonna, part of my French, screw this, I'm gonna move to, Florida or New York or wherever on the mainland. So the energy issue in Puerto Rico is not just an issue for, large scale manufacturing, or not just an issue for our tourism sector or those types of sectors. It's also a quality of life issue, which, at the end of the day is, I would say, top three in terms of the factors that move the needle in economic development is talent, is, workforce.
When you so for those who aren't familiar with Invest Puerto Rico, it's the investment attraction, investment promotion, and economic development organization. Quasi public, works with DDEC, works with the private sector. Was
Yep.
created by the legislature. When you guys talk to serious investors about Puerto Rico, what do they hire the island to do? What's the problem they come to Puerto Rico to solve?
So that's a great question. It depends. It's very sector specific. So when we're talking about manufacturing, which continues to represent between 40 and 50% of the GDP of the island, And that's a legacy of, post-war Operation Bootstrap and the tax incentives and, the fact that we were the original, basically globalization for the spot for the US for offshoring before, all the other players, China, et cetera, entered into the picture, right? So we have a legacy in pharmaceutical medical device manufacturing, right? So when we're talking to those types of companies, what we're talking about is expertise, what I was talking about before in terms of talent. And the folks on the island in terms of manufacturing those types of products, the manufacturing processes to do those things are second to none in the world. And we're recognized as that, kind of at a global level in that specific sector.
So,
So,
so
so if I'm talking to somebody in that sector, that's the argument that I'm going to have
so
for.
let's stick with that for a second. When you have serious or great prospects that say no, what why do they say it? What's the common reason for why they say no to Puerto Rico and yes to other jurisdictions? And how do we de-risk that in the near term?
Sure. And again, this is very sector specific. But in manufacturing, when people say no, it's because there's, so Puerto Rico, when it was originally developed as a manufacturing powerhouse, had public financing of industrial real estate, and public financing, and availability of the power grid, right? Currently, Pritco, can no longer offer the same level of, industrial, property financing. So a lot of times what it comes down to is real estate availability, industrial real estate availability, and other jurisdictions offering to, build to suit, manufacturing facilities, for those companies. So a lot of times it comes down to that. So, unfortunately, a lot of times it comes down to kind of an incentives arms race. The other thing that we hear a lot is, again, the demographic issue. So they'll say, we have very high caliber of talent on the island, but maybe, the quantity and availability currently of the talent is not there. So they'll say, we see that Puerto Rico does have, again, the quality at the executive level or at the special, technical levels of talent, but we're going to locate in an area that has higher, population density so that we know that there'll be greater availability of talent in those locations. So those are the two things that, especially on the manufacturing side, really move the needle in terms of when people say no. Going back to the real estate question, power availability and power cost, is always part of the conversation. So, when we're talking about an industrial expansion project in manufacturing, people who are already on the island and they know how things work here, um, that conversation is less of an issue because they understand that we can make it work
They've
most of the
navigated
time.
it before. Yeah.
Right, we've navigated before, we can make it work. So when I'm talking to an Amgen or Boston Scientific or somebody, we can talk about, on-site generation, we can talk about, how do you build redundancies into the system, et cetera. That becomes a much harder conversation with a company that's not here because generally what's happening is they're using a site selector or they're using, if they're using their in-house, kind of, folks who do site selection, they're generally comparing Puerto Rico with other jurisdictions. So either where they have their headquarters or other jurisdictions where they already have manufacturing. And so if they're saying, well, we're talking with Texas or we're talking with Costa Rica or we're talking with Ireland, and energy doesn't even come up as a factor because it's just kind of a given that there's going to be access to, the high voltage lines that are reliable, reliable and at cost, et cetera. Why is it even, why should I consider Puerto Rico when that has to be a conversation that needs to take place, right? So it becomes a factor that can potentially be a red flag that throws us off of the list in the first place. So our challenge, especially in the manufacturing sector, and again, it's very sector specific how we present Puerto Rico's value proposition, but because manufacturing and reshoring and the federal, administration's efforts currently to bring manufacturing back to the United States, I think it's a very relevant, conversation to have. But our challenge at Invest Puerto Rico is how do we make sure that we remain on the site selectors lists and that we don't get automatically disqualified because of the energy question. Because when they see, well, what's the average ratepayer paying in Puerto Rico? Power outages, front page, generation, power generation issues, et cetera, that could scare them away. And we're not even being considered for some of these large scale manufacturing projects. When in the reality, there are ways to mitigate a lot of the things that I just said, but they have to be open to that conversation in the first place.
Yeah.
So that it just becomes a factor that we have to navigate that other jurisdictions don't necessarily have to navigate.
Well, and I've seen it where they have an Excel sheet where they, they put it in a column,
Exactly.
and there's literally no space for anything other than a number,
Right.
and they're going to take the number that, the official rate is,
And I
and
mean,
run it through the Excel program, and it's okay.
I mean, I'm an economist and I've worked in consulting before. I get it. If I'm sitting in a room somewhere in California or New York or Berlin, and I'm looking and I'm comparing jurisdictions, and my energy column, all it says is, how many days of outages a year, and what's the going industrial rate for power. Okay, well, Puerto Rico, uncheck that box. That's no longer going to be on my short list, which is why a big job that we have at Invest Puerto Rico is educating the site selection community about what we do have to offer and about the nuances that get lost when people are just looking at a spreadsheet.
So before we dive more deeply into the power and energy sectors, just a couple of questions on sort of macro view and macro trajectory of the island.
Hmm.
In June, the Puerto Rico, the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, FOMB, put out an outlook for Puerto Rico's economy, their first economic forecasting symposium. The Planning Board, Puerto Rico Planning Board, projects a 1.2% real GNP growth for the current fiscal year that started in July at the beginning of this month. The FOMB projects a contraction of 0.8%. What do you think accounts for this difference, and where do your projections as an economist fall in the midst?
Um, I looked at both of the projections. I think a lot of it has to do with how you account for demographic changes and how you account for the pace of spending of federal funds in Puerto Rico, which, for better or worse, the federal funds issue on the island, and especially post Maria, which we're still, kind of picking up the pieces of FEMA funding for a lot of those projects. The pace has, varies by project. And I know you spoke with Manuel Lavoy in a prior conversation. He's much obviously better versed in all those processes of federal funds outlays. But I think the biggest things right now, question marks, in terms of you know growth on the island, or the performance of the island from an economic standpoint, is demographics and federal funds.
So on the federal funds point, Puerto Rico is the most dependent jurisdiction in the U.S. on
Yep,
federal funds. 96% of the Department of Housing is federally funded. 90% of the Department of Family. 68% of the Department of Health. These are
yep.
astronomical. I mean, I think the Department of Education's in the 60s as well. Astronomical compared to other jurisdictions. And we have a administration in Washington who's sort of aggressively looking to peel back federal funding availability, particularly as it may pertain to disaster in the previous decade. What does the island do to pivot in a new landscape away from disaster relief funds for? I mean, you talked about competitive pillars. These funds will go away. What's the strategy to pivot away from these funds?
I mean, it's a huge question. I do think that there needs to be reality check at the central government level in Puerto Rico. And, part of that is um, you know, what is it? The Fiscal Control Board is there. Um, you know, regardless of what you think of FOMB, it's kind of um, a necessary evil. And, you know, there needed to be a reality check, right? In terms of the size of government, in terms of the role of government in everyday lives of Puerto Rico's economy. So I think, going forward, we need to start thinking of a world without FOMB, a world with more limited access to federal funding, to your prior point, and a world where municipal finances are more sustainable. A world where a lot of areas of everyday economic life that it's taken for granted in Puerto Rico that the government has some type of hand in. It's not going to be that way going forward. So I think, if I was, a high level policymaker on the island thinking about that, I would be thinking of how do we make sure that the fiscal control rails, right, the boxes that the FOMB has put the government in terms of, being a little bit more fiscally conservative. How do we make sure that that extends beyond FOMB not being on the island? And who knows when that will happen. But I would be creating a a local government capacity to manage the budget in the same way that the FOMB does, and then also think about ways to shrink, understanding that the federal government is not going to, in the new normal, the federal government is not going to have the same level of engagement in terms of funding of Puerto Rico's economy. So I
So
think there needs to be a rethinking of the role of government in Puerto Rico. And
the,
that,
so
that's privatization in some cases. That's, looking to other jurisdictions and copying other jurisdictions in other cases. But unfortunately, we can't, fortunately or unfortunately, we can't keep going the way that's how we got into the fiscal mess in the first place was, we just kept going at the same rate of government involvement in the local economy for political reasons, it's just easier politically to say yes to everybody and not
until
say
it's
no to
not,
anybody
until there's
until
a
it's not.
bankruptcy. And
Right.
I think that this is just in a segue to the close of this section of our conversation. 2 weeks ago, the FOMB director, Robert Mujica, was in front of
Yep.
Congress and made a couple of these key points, right? The, longer term, stabilized, institutional, cultural changes necessary for fiscal responsibility,
Yep.
and perhaps a decentralization away from central government that's in some cases created a bloated bottleneck in some cases, right? That has led to poor decision making over the long term on the island. So
And
the
and
question,
and I would just add real quick, Sam,
yeah,
the boogeyman here is not just the government. The private sector on the island also has a lot, and I think they have more to say and more influence on this than they give themselves credit for, and that they've actively or not been active in making this point. I think the private sector, and in many cases it's because it's easier, it's more comfortable to just, keep the things going as they've been going and depend on federally funded programs and keep the government the way it is, et cetera, et cetera. I do think the private sector, there needs to be a reckoning as well in terms of what kind of role they want the government to have in the economy going forward. So I wouldn't put all the onus on the political parties or on government officials. I think the private sector has a much stronger role to play in terms of, okay, what do we want the island to look like? Understanding that this is going to be the new normal going forward, right? And I'm not here advocating and saying, because there's this whole movement now of economic liberty, and that conversation has never really happened in Puerto Rico in the past. And I'm not saying, there's two extremes here. You can have like an extreme libertarian view where everything is privatized and, we shrink the government to this to nothing, two guys in a room. Or you have the other end where, the local government is involved, deeply and fully in every aspect of Puerto Ricans' lives, right? The answer is in the middle somewhere. And, you know, we just need to understand that there's going to be constraints that's going to move that. And we're not going to have in the future, we're not going to have as much ability as a government, as a society, as a private sector to determine that. So now I feel like we have almost a grace period now, where there's still some federal funding available for some of these projects for infrastructure, et cetera, where we have FOMB. We need to take advantage of this situation to move that needle to where we think, is an acceptable level for the island to be at. Because in the future, it's going to be moved for us. Because
So
we're just not going to have the capacity to keep the government size the way it is, or et cetera. So.
So thinking about local government, and then one more question about sort of my key takeaway from the oversight hearing last
Hmm.
2 weeks ago. Um, Thinking about the decentralization away from state level government and into municipalities, what municipality, and I know Invest represents the whole island and doesn't have favorites, but as you look analytically across the 78 municipalities, what municipality is most investable today, but perhaps underappreciated? And what's the asset there?
Sure. And I don't want to play favorites or anything, but I think Caguas, and one of the big reasons is the mayor of Caguas, who I know and I've worked directly with on economic development, uh, projects. He has a very knowledgeable team, and he understands the language of economic development, and he is very open, and he understands, what it means to be business friendly, what it means to receive potential clients, potential investors into his municipality. So I would say the municipality of Caguas is very business uh, friendly and forward looking. The current administration in San Juan has been more open than some of the prior administrations to these types of conversations. Um, and then I would also say on the northwest coast of the island, Aguadilla and Arecibo, there's appetites for investment into the island, into those municipalities, understanding how to become more attractive from a business development standpoint for larger scale economic development projects in those municipalities. Um, the municipalities where you know there might be one or two municipalities, I'm not going to mention names, that are actively kind of uh, opposed. Not, I wouldn't say opposed, but are are actively kind of um, uh, how do you call it? Uh, uh, Working against these types of projects. And again, I don't want to name names, but the majority of the 78 municipalities um, just don't have the capacity or don't really understand, at a municipal level, what economic development actually is. Um, or they have other issues that they need to take care of first. So economic development becomes kind of a back burner type issue. And I understand that as well. It's reasonable understanding the limits in terms of the municipal financing, and in terms of capacity, in terms of staffing, et cetera. So I understand that. I do think there needs to be a greater role of regionalization in economic development on the island. You know, there's 78 fiefdoms, unfortunately. You know, for better or worse, a lot of them aren't working in conjunction. There are some bright spots. There's some regional economic development activities, like on the south side of the island. There's the Southern Puerto Rico Economic Development District, which brings together 8 or 9 municipalities on the south coast of the island, centered on Ponce, that have started dialogues around how do we create a better regional view of economic development, in terms of integrating infrastructure, in terms of the way that we promote and market the availability of talent, the availability of real estate, et cetera. There's also in the Caguas region, there's also a regional economic development nonprofit that does a pretty good job of that. But I think the rest of the island needs to learn from those things, and can't just be so municipal centric. There needs
Yeah.
to be a greater regional view of economic development, as well as other things, education, and then things so pedestrian as garbage collection, municipal waste management, water management. We just saw this last weekend. Issues with Carraizo and the water authority. A lot of those things. There's solutions with greater regional involvement, greater municipal autonomy. So I think that future that we're talking about, where federal funds will not be as readily available, and a world where FOMB is not going to be there policing budgets. There is a world where Puerto Rico needs to, for better or worse, be more regional focused, and where municipalities on the island have to have a bigger role in the day-to-day things such as economic development.
So that may be an answer to my next question, but going back to the oversight hearing from the FOMB, I think one of the key themes, and I wrote about this in an article that the Energy Forum published on LinkedIn, on my reflections of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
How do you emerge from bankruptcy without increasing the cost of living burden for the island? And I think that's true for the broader government emerging from bankruptcy, as it did a couple of years ago. But the key bankruptcy that's still looming over Puerto Rico is the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still ongoing legal battles over what's going to happen for the $9+ billion and what the bondholders want to be able to rescue. So maybe as succinctly as you can, what are the keys to emerging from bankruptcy without having sort of an outsized negative impact on the cost of living burden for businesses or residents?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think, you know, a, a large scale rethinking of economic development on the island is going to be very difficult to happen until we emerge from the bankruptcy of PREPA, and a rethinking of the energy grid. I think people don't understand you know the limitations currently that the bankruptcy have placed on energy grid rebuilding, right? Um, and there hasn't been a rate increase. I know people don't like to hear this, but there hasn't been a rate increase, I think, in like almost 10 years, 8 years or something like that, to the island. Um, you know, I the way that I think of energy on the island, I don't want there to be, obviously, clean energy, implementation of solar and all of those things are very positive. At kind of a local level, right? But my biggest fear is that we're going to be creating basically a haves and have-not situation of energy, where people who have the means and the to have on-site generation, or solar panels, residential, is going to be at a deficit for the rest of the system, right? So you're going to how do you come out of this and not create a haves and have-not situation, not just on energy, but on other things as well. There's already high levels of inequality in Puerto Rico compared to, other states in the US. How do we make sure, I think the biggest challenge as we emerge from bankruptcy is how do you make sure that that doesn't continue to get worse? And again, that goes to electrical grid, but it goes to other areas of that affect quality of life as well. So that's my biggest fear, kind of coming out of the bankruptcy. You know, to your, there, and I think energy in Puerto Rico becomes this political, you know, ball that goes back and forth, and you can make enemies easily, and you can point to the bad guys very easily, and um, I think people in Puerto Rico need to be educated and talked to on the most stark, realistic terms around what we're talking about when we talk about energy. And it can't continue to be kind of a political, question that you could say whatever you want about, or you make the bad guy out to be whoever. And I'm not here defending Luma or defending Haneda or defending anybody. I'm just saying there needs to be kind of a adults in the room sit down and talk about what are we actually talking about. Um, you know, I don't know when it was, a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago. They had proposed rate increases, et cetera. But if you looked and read into what they're actually proposing, they were saying if we want to improve um, Puerto Rico's electrical grid to a point where we are competitive with other modern economies in the United States or elsewhere, this is what it's going to cost. It costs a
And
lot of
actually, it was a little bit more simple than that. They said if we want to cover the costs of just operating and maintaining the grid
right.
today, it's got to go up,
I
and
mean,
and and
if you
in the
look at
process of modernizing it.
the capex budget of what's made available under the current contractual situation, it's a fraction of what other jurisdictions spend. The whole reason we got into this mess with the electrical grid on the island was because it was politically expedient to not raise rates, to push maintenance and investment into the electrical grid, kick the can down the road, to offer no-show type political jobs, et cetera, right? And the reckoning eventually came. If we want to move past this, then this needs to be made a priority, um, and we need to be adults about it.
So
It can't be a political issue, a wedge issue. It has to be everybody sitting at the table saying, what do we want Puerto Rico to look like in 10 years? What's it
and
going to
and
cost to
so
get there, and what do we have
so
to sacrifice to do that?
to that point, and I think this is where, you know, we can shift the conversation a little bit away from energy as an input to the economy and energy as a sector in its own right, because
Hmm.
a lot of the private utility scale investors that would otherwise participate, they don't care who's to blame politically. They see, what's happening with the NFE and PREPA
Yep.
debacle, and they see what's happening with the power expectations in the emergency generation procurement scandal in the making, and they see the signals to and more serious steps to cancel Luma's contract. They don't care who's to blame to a certain degree. They see
Right.
them as broad negative signals. How do we mitigate what those signals send to private investors that otherwise would say, look, we have the expertise, we have the technical capacity, we want to come in and participate either by developing a large scale project, a
Hmm.
power plant, utility scale solar project, supporting grid repairs, et cetera. How do we mitigate some of these negative signals and attract that community that can participate?
Supporting the Puerto Rico Energy Forum and conversations such as this one, again, with adults in the room talking about these issues. Um, I don't care who you are on the political spectrum, what party you're in, what party you represent. When you sit down and actually talk to people about, okay, this is what's actually going on. These are the options. These are the alternatives. Let's have a realistic conversation about what this is going to cost, um, what we have to sacrifice in order to get these things done. Once you do those things in these types of forums, you could start to move the conversation a little bit. What frustrates me is when these things become, again, political balls to be thrown around, or to be, there's irreparable damage, to your point before. Every time there's a negative story on the front page of a Nuevo Dia talking about these things, you know, it's not just these aren't just words that are being spilled, uh, for political expediency. These are things that the next, if you're going to cancel Luma's contract, whoever's going to be bidding on a future contract is going to have worse, they're going to have worse terms, and they're going to be charging more money because they saw the debacle that happened, or that's currently happening, or the fact that they're being made out into scapegoats.
Or
So
even threatened to happen, right?
right. So, and that's just one example. I mean, you mentioned the other examples of, with NFE, the examples with, the RFPs, all of those things, when we don't take these things seriously, and when we politicize these things, um, there's negative consequences. How do you get beyond that? You get beyond that by having professionals, people who know what they're talking about, people who are don't have political skin in the game necessarily, um, can educate and talk about these things and create forums and plans and forums where subject matter experts, can actually say, okay, there is a path forward for Puerto Rico. This is what it's going to look like. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be politically expedient.
Credibility is a slow ladder to climb. And I'll just say that let me add one other idea to your list there, which is highlighting successful
Yes.
stories where they
Yes.
are goes a long way. And I was really happy that we had the opportunity last week to speak to Jesus Intron, who's
Mm-hmm.
the federal projects senior manager at Genera, who's managing this 430 megawatt BESS
The
project.
best project. Yep.
That is going to be one of the most significant projects, not only from a technical and technological input to the grid, but the credibility that comes with showing we can manage a
Yes.
nearly billion-dollar project with a global name like Tesla and get it done and be able to point to like it's making an impact right now.
I
That
mean, I
goes a
think
long way to improving our ability to attract competitive bidders down the line.
to that point, when we're talking about economic development, FDI, and when we're talking to prospects who want to do business on the island, the way that we attack these things is through case studies and through talking with people who have been able to do these things, showing them cogeneration systems, showing them the redundancies, showing them what Amgen is able to do, with 16 diesel generators and the LNG project that they're undertaking. I mean, showing those types of situations, showing shared microgrids and where those things are working. Once they see those things, then they can say, okay, yeah, we'll think about Puerto Rico now. So again, to your point, case studies where these things are actually happening, and that are positive to be able to point to. Because again, and I don't want to be doom and gloom on this, on this call. There's a lot of good things, and there's a lot of value proposition upside, in Puerto Rico across sectors: manufacturing, professional services, hospitality. Um, but we have to get past, some of these other issues that we've discussed today, to be able to get to those positive stories and to be able to sell and promote the island effectively. We just need to have solutions and not just problems, when we talk to potential investors and potential
it,
clients.
it's also important to recognize that all of this is but I always talked about having multiple pathways towards success in the energy sector, right? We need a
Hmm.
macro grid that works, but the worse the macro grid is, the better the economics are for microgrids and industrial users to say, oh yeah, it's not just 20% savings, it's
Very
now
true.
30% savings because the costs have gone up on the macro level. So
Yep.
there's a little bit of a double-edged sword here. If you had to put a number on it, what's the dampening effect of PREPA's lingering bankruptcy on economic growth on the island?
I wouldn't venture to put like a percentage number on it, but I do think that it's been a huge drag. I think people have underestimated it. I think people don't really understand it. When I read articles or look at kind of public discourse and pelotadura or whatever, I'm like, I don't think people are kind of getting, the fact that has not been able to be negotiated, has been a huge disadvantage to moving the ball forward, in the energy sector on the island, from a public standpoint, from a generation standpoint, and from a distribution standpoint. That being said, to your prior point, there are opportunities, not just as energy as an input. Energy as an input, uh, is huge, in economic development, right? There's no such thing as a high income, low energy country. It just doesn't exist. It's a linear relationship between economic development and energy consumption, right? Um, so energy is an input, very important. But I also think that there's energy as an economic development sector, um, is something that we have explored at Invest Puerto Rico, and we have seen movement in terms of new companies being able to come to the island, in renewable energy, in smart grid, technologies, in solar panel manufacturing. Solex, that was a huge project that we help to bring to the island. So, we're in conversations now with battery, energy battery storage solution companies to come here. Some of the tariffs that have been announced in the last few months has shifted the conversation around some of these things as well. So I think thinking about energy not as an impediment and not just as an input for economic development, but also as its own sector on the island is another way to kind of reframe as an opportunity, the historical moment that we're in Puerto Rico currently.
So I want to invite anybody on the line who may have questions to throw them in chat. We're coming up on the last 10 minutes of our conversation. John, I've got a series of questions here, sort of laid out for a lightning round. You can respond overrated, underrated, or just sort of a succinct response. Are you up for that?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
All right. Act 60 for energy sector incentives.
I think it hasn't been used to its potential yet. I
Is
think
that
there
in the manufacturing chapter or green energy chapter?
both, both. I think there needs to be a greater push to for people to understand different models that chapter can work under. But I think there's huge potential there. So I think that it's kind of underrated from that standpoint. I think there's potential there to exploit that even further.
Uh, Puerto Rico as a sandbox for energy sector R&D.
Additionally, I think that there's more potential there than we've been able to move the needle on yet. I think, the biggest missing link there is academia, and how do we create linkages? Because if you look at other places where those types of relationships work, like Research Triangle in North Carolina, for example, or Massachusetts for biosector, you really need that linkage between researchers, universities, and the private sector. So I think, Puerto Rico has the potential to be that sandbox because of the costs, because of a closed environment of an island, because of the historical nature of how our energy grid was developed, all of those things, federal funding opportunities. But I think one of the missing links there is the university partnership piece. So I think there's a potential there to grow that.
Opportunity zones as a catalyst for real industrial projects.
So opportunity zones, unfortunately, the projects that we've seen thus far have not been huge job creation type projects beyond construction phase. There's been a lot of hospitality development and some limited commercial and residential development, but on the industrial side, we haven't seen a lot. So, there's a lot of reasons behind that. There's also in the big beautiful bill, there's going to be some changes coming down on the opportunity zone front. So, I think I would probably say, from what was promised when that legislation was introduced, it's been a disappointment from an economic development standpoint, except in kind of limited case studies.
Roosevelt Roads as a realistic investment opportunity in the near future.
So, Roosevelt Roads, and I'm only allowed to say some limited specific things here. Roosevelt Roads, um, you know, I think the way that the government through the last 20-25 years has gone about, thinking about Roosevelt Roads, leaves a lot to be desired. That being said, there are projects currently right now that have been identified and that are moving forward at Roosevelt Road. So I do see some positive signs there. But I don't think it's going to be, um, I don't think it's going to be some kind of panacea or some kind of super node of economic activity that some people might think it's going to be. But I do think that there are potential opportunities there that are currently in the process of just starting. So I'd be interested. I know saying this about something that has been under the brick process for the last 25 years, the base closure process, whatever they call it, under the U.S. Navy, for the last 20 years. Saying that I'm looking forward to the next 5 years is kind of a little bit disingenuous, but I do think from the last few things I've heard about projects that are occurring there, I do have some glimmers of hope.
Puerto Rico emerging from this slew of tariff deals with successfully landing nearshoring or rearshoring projects.
I'm bullish on that. Um, in my mind, reshoring and nearshoring is everything that we do for FDI attraction. So it's really nothing new. Reshoring as a concept is kind of a spin on economic development in general and FDI, especially on FDI attraction, foreign direct investment attraction in general. But that being said, I do think that I've had many, numerous conversations about this. Once the dust settles, right now, basically what we've been hearing, and not just in Puerto Rico, but across the US as well, is that there's so much uncertainty that's been kicked up because of, the, the announcements and the negotiations, et cetera, that a lot of people are on hold in terms of FDI. I do think when the dust settles, it'll be a net benefit for Puerto Rico.
What's
Uh,
the one region that you think we would attract companies from? Is it Europe? Is it more Latin America? Most of the trade deals we've seen have been with Asia and Europe. Are those the target markets then to bring companies in from?
yes. So it's basically most of the time it's companies that are multinational that have operations around the world. A lot of times they're headquartered either in Europe or in the United States that have operations in other parts of the world that are going to be feeling the effects of tariffs because of those operations, then rethinking about domestic manufacturing and Puerto Rico being an option. And again, it's not in every sector of manufacturing. It's very specific to the types of things that we do well. And Puerto Rico's value proposition, again, is not for everybody. But in the areas that Puerto Rico plays well in, it's going to be a net positive. And we're already seeing increased interest from companies and sectors that currently, before we're not even thinking about Puerto Rico on the radar, currently considering us. So I think the logistics sector that we have on the island that connects well with supply chains, the air cargo logistics, maritime logistics, the fact that we're U.S. territory, made in USA, U.S. citizens, coupled with Act 60, coupled with the talent that we have, the current situation when the dust settles is gonna bode well for Puerto Rico.
Okay, next three questions have absolutely nothing to do with energy, and you can answer as concisely as you'd like. Bad Bunny's concert series is projected to raise the GDP by an estimated 0.15%. Do you buy that?
Um, as an economist and as somebody who knows that you can make numbers and statistics say whatever you want them to say, I'm going to say yes. I'll buy it. Because
Plantains is an
if you
export
told
crop.
me if you told me, John, I'm going to pay you 25 grand to create a study saying that the Bad Bunny's residency is gonna raise the GDP by 0.15, I'd say sure, I'll do that.
I can make that happen.
You can make it happen with multiplier effects and with increased stays at hotels and blah blah. You can make it happen.
Plantains is an export crop.
Uh, so
I asked Manuel
agriculture,
Lavoy this. He said he'd have to get back to me. So I'm
yeah,
following up with you.
you know, maybe replacing, doing import substitution with plantains is probably a greater likelihood than as an export crop.
Okay. The Jets ending with a winning record this year.
I would say 8% chance. I'm not positive. I'm not very high on the Jets this year, unfortunately.
Yeah. Last time they did it was with Ryan Fitzpatrick in 2015.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Maybe if you bring back Brian Fitzpatrick.
all right. Final question. If a CEO is on the fence looking at Puerto Rico, what's the single action you want them to take in the next, in the next period to perhaps change their mind?
Come
What
here.
would you show them?
You come here, and we will show you how we make it work, how we have uh, very high quality talent, how our logistics sector is highly advanced, and how other multinational companies make it work. You know, it's much harder to do my job when we're doing it over email, we're doing it over Zoom, we're doing it over Excel spreadsheets. It's much easier, and this is why in West Puerto Rico we host fam tours all the time, both with CEOs, site selectors, and sector specific fam tours. Once they come here and see it and it clicks, it makes our job that much easier.
John, that was my last question. So let me thank you before we get to the
I,
question in the chat.
oh
Uh,
yeah, I was gonna say somebody said something in the chat.
really appreciate you joining the Puerto Rico Energy Forum, and thanks for an insightful conversation.
No, this has been great.
So Ignacio asked, what can you disclose about the recent wins in the pharma sector, and maybe things down the pike that you can share with us?
So recent wins, there's been a bunch of expansions, and there's a bunch of expansions that are currently in the pipeline. That some that I could talk about by name. I don't know how much I could talk about some of the expansions. The Teva facility in Fajardo was recently acquired by Millicent, and there's going to be a big project that's going on at that facility. There's
That's huge. The East needs it.
Yeah, there's a couple projects that are currently in the pipeline around contract manufacturing. So basically, using capacity that it currently exists at some of the facilities, especially around solid dose and some of the biologics. Um, they have current excess capacity that they're basically contracting, doing contract manufacturing for. So, we're constantly looking for those types of opportunities as well. And then on the medical device side, we're working on a few expansions, and there's a Japanese company that we're working on that works in conjunction with a company that's already here called Terumo. So that's a positive on the medical device manufacturing side. We're also working with some gene and cell therapy companies that are on the smaller side, so kind of more startup scale. So they might be, in venture capital type phase. But we're actively working to land them in Puerto Rico so that they do some of their R&D and development type stuff here. And then obviously the medium and long term is that they'll grow and they'll continue to do manufacturing on the island, is kind of the longer term play on that. But there's a lot of expansions happening. Some that are announced publicly and others that aren't announced. But there's a lot of investment in that sector. So I continue to be bullish on Puerto Rico for manufacturing for pharmaceuticals.
Awesome. John, thank you. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, I invite all of your what do you call them? Viewers, listeners, podcast or forum
Audience.
members to go to investpr.org and look at how we present the value proposition of Puerto Rico, in different sectors. And then, if you're not already friends with me on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out. Follow Invest Puerto Rico on LinkedIn. We're always doing stuff, and it's always good to meet new people and collaborate with folks who are working for the best interest of the island. So I'm always available for a coffee or a chat if you're so inclined.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, John. See you
Take
later.
care. Yep. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.